This week, the agenda looked at writing your biological biography, the future of faith, and what recent polling numbers tell us about the future of Premier Kathleen Wynne. The agenda's week in review begins with planning for an election when the writs haven't even been dropped. Usually when people do what you do, you know when the end date is, right? And we've had mostly majority governments in Ontario for the last quarter century, so you can always point in the calendar and say, that's when the election is, and that's when we're going to aim everything. You don't know that now. So Ian, when you're trying to do all of the things that we've been talking about, how do you do them knowing that you don't know when the election is?
Yeah, the analogy I use, it's you're a dad. It's a little like when you have your first child. You know, somewhere between 7.5 months and 9 months, it's coming. You don't know the exact day, but you know at some point you need to be ready.
You don't even know that now. It could be spring, could be fall, could be next year.
It could be. But at the end of the day, we know one thing, which is we need to have a plan and a program to change the direction of this province. So we've spent a lot of time in the last year developing a plan to actually fix Ontario. We've reverse engineered by asking a very fundamental question, which is, what do we actually need to do to fix Ontario? The answer to that question is as relative today as it will be a year from now, depending on how much deeper the damage is that these two guys end up doing to the province.
You know what, I gotta say, can I just say,
and we were all getting along so well.
Can I just say, I actually think Ontario is a pretty good place to live and grow and raise a kid. So I don't know what province he lives in, but it's not the same one the rest of us live in, I think.
With the debt that's doubled.
It's not, just to be clear.
We're going to get back on topic now, ladies.
What we also know, from a timing of the election point of view, is that the Conservatives have decided that they don't care about governing, right? They're going to vote a government down no matter what. They want to go to the polls no matter, like they just have decided they don't care about how the province is governed or the right answer. They're just going to vote against anything.
They don't care about how the province is
governed. Well, they're
governed.
behaving that way in terms of how they vote. In terms of how they vote in the House.
Gentlemen, I'm going to stop this because this is off topic. I want to get back on the question of how do you do what you do when you don't know when the end date actually is?
Yeah, so basically you got to get mostly ready, right? I mean, obviously you're you know, because you're living, you know, as government, our first priority is governing well for Ontarians. But obviously we know we have to get the support of, well, we would have hoped one of the two others, but in this case only one other party. And so, but you have to prepare for the opportunity or for the likelihood that you can lose or, but the hope that you don't. So what you know though is because of that, there are points in the parliamentary calendar where that's likely to occur. More likely to occur than others. So one is the budget, right? So you know that's kind of a date you're working potentially towards where you'd prefer not to, but you know that's a cleavage point in terms of what the two other parties do. And
what's the next one after that?
Well, I don't know, actually. It's a good question. Depends a little bit on whether one of the two of these parties decide to move a non-confidence vote. It'd seem a little odd if the NDP decided to support the government in a budget to then bring it down a few days afterwards. But, you know, I've certainly seen less than rational decisions made by other parties in the past, so you just never know. So but there are, like, you know, so as I said, you kind of prepare for, you know, the potential we could lose the confidence of the House in May and then probably not till the fall, but you can't guarantee that. So you got to get mostly ready.
NDP support on budgets, though.
Right. Once one election has ended, the next one has started. And so as soon as the election ends and people get a little bit of time to recover, then we do the debrief and we go over all the data and the results, and we look at the money, and oh, the Green Party's not in debt after this election. Isn't that wonderful? And we move forward with planning for the next campaign, and we establish our priorities. We help to understand our voter. What is our message? What is our strategy?
So
how are we going to build capacity?
October 2011, you started running for the next election.
Absolutely. We start planning for it, yes.
Okay, Nathan, tell me this then. Again, going back to my example of you're trying to get people to run for you. How do you get somebody to say, I'm going to quit my job, I'm going to live off my savings, and I'm going to run, knock on doors for the next, how many days? I don't know. You want me to do this maybe for a week or 5 months or a year? Tough conversation?
Definitely, but I think the important part for us is that the party has been getting a lot of support in the last few years, and both federally as well as provincially. So we have candidates who are willing to run, who are willing to put the time, effort, and put their passion and dedication into the candidacy. So we are in a position where we can actually start to look at different candidates, and the ridings can decide who the best candidate is.
You have shared with us, which we will now share with our viewers, a lot of numbers on how things are going down at Queen's Park right now. And let's start with the obvious one, which is if an election were held today, what would people do? And let's control room, bring that up first and foremost. Here's the vote. I can't ever recall, and maybe you can help me, Greg, when things were this close among the top three parties. Explain.
Well, not only are they this close right now, but they've been that close for over a year. What we've seen is over the past decade, both the Tories and the Liberals have lost ground. When we started doing our monthly tracking back in April of 2000, typically 70 to 75% of the public, if you just stop them on the street, 7 out of 10 would say, I'm supporting the Liberals or the Tories. Today, we rarely find more than half saying they support the Liberals or the Tories. Some of that has gone to the NDP, and that's why the NDP is now in the race. But some of it's on the sidelines, waiting to be mobilized to come back in.
If we can see that graphic again, one of the things two things to pick up on. Number one, the undecided's at 12%. Usually pollsters take that 12% and they sort of spread it evenly among the other guys. How come you haven't done that?
Well, I believe you need to be able to see what the race really is. So the issue isn't just who's supporting, what share of the vote the parties have, but how much more of the electorate is out there available to be rallied to a party. So 12% are undecided, but 14% say they wouldn't even vote or they don't care enough to say. And so when you put that together, the wouldn't vote, won't say, wouldn't, don't know who they support, none of the above, all those together is 26%, which is more than any one of the parties.
Right. So fair to say this is a completely open race. We have no idea who will win the next election based on those numbers.
Absolutely. There's no way of knowing at this stage. But one thing we can say is we've seen stories like this before. This is very reminiscent of what happened in Manitoba in 1988 when Sharon Carstairs came from nowhere to all of a sudden almost become the premier. And it's the same thing that happened with Gordon Wilson. What happens is people get tired of the two main parties and it stops being an issue of left versus right and it starts to become an issue of new versus old.
Okay, Greg, let's bring up the second chart now. And you call this one value clusters.
Right.
And this indicates, again, with I think a lot more depth than normal, how the voter out there sort of breaks down. And do you want to take us through this, starting with, say, the top right-hand corner, where almost a third of the people identify themselves as, solid blue conservatives and then go from there?
Right. Well, what we do is that we ask people where they stand on issues, and then we use a process called clustering to group people that share common points of view. So if you look at the conservatives, those are people that say the government spending should be according to its ability to pay, not according to the needs of the public. Every other cluster says spending should be based according to need, not ability to pay. So you can see with the deficit coming up that there's a polarization there that leaves the conservatives with their hard budget message with about a third of the public on their side, but 2/3 against them on that. If we then bring in how do people feel about businesses.
Let's bring it up again, guys, so we can see this again.
Sure.
Where all right, so that 32% who are solidly conservative, Tim Hudak's got them all.
He's got them. He has over 60% of those voters.
But I see that there are sort of 3 different colors that the Liberals can play with here. How does
they
that
can
work?
actually play with 4 with Kathleen Wynne, which makes it interesting.
Okay.
And in fact, if you're not with the Tories and the Conservatives, then you're with Wynne, right? You're with the Liberals. So they are the second choice there. And if the Tories stumble and the Liberals don't alienate that group, they can pick up some second choice. If you look at the business Liberals, the next cluster over, those are people that think that business is the way to go. They believe that profit encourages hard work, that it doesn't create negative consequences. But there's only 2 groups that like business. That's the business Liberals and the Conservatives. The other 3 groups don't like them very much or actually dislike business. And especially the more to the left you go, the better it is. So if you think about the campaign positions of the Tories and the NDP on something like how do we treat business, the Tories have nothing to lose by saying we should encourage business. The NDP have nothing to lose by saying we should make business pay its share. The Liberals are torn. They're in a difficult position because half of their potential coalition thinks that business is pretty good, but the other half thinks it's not so much.
Confusing.
And then you go on to that to look at redistributing wealth. Is the job of government to create a level playing field and let everyone run their own race, or is the job of government to make sure that we all end up about the same place at the end of the race? Well, the moderate levelers, the whole idea of levelers, is that they think government's job is to make sure we all end up around the same place, and the core left believes similarly. So you put all that together and you see, relatively speaking, how easy it is from a policy perspective to run a campaign from the left or right, and how hard it is to run a campaign from the center.
You write, there is nothing easy, simple, or comfortable about evangelical Catholicism. The cultural Catholicism of the past was comfortable because it fit neatly within the ambient public culture, causing little chafing between one's life in the church and one's life in the world. Evangelical Catholicism, by contrast, is a counterculture that seeks to convert the ambient public culture. Evangelical Catholicism does not seek to get along, it seeks to convert. Okay, I hear where you're coming from on that, but perhaps one word you use there that prompts a question, which is, how is evangelical Catholicism countercultural?
It builds communities of human solidarity, Steve, that live differently than the rest of postmodern Western culture tends to live. We are absorbed in a culture today in which the God many people worship is the God of me, myself, and I. A culture in which self-assertion is understood to be the apex of human nobility. Christianity teaches a very different truth, a genuine truth, I would say, and that is that life is meant to be gift. Each of our lives is a gift to us, unmerited and unrequested. We are to make our lives into a gift for others as our own lives are a gift to us. Not self-assertion, but self-gift. The communities that form around that conviction are going to be more humane, more compassionate, more open, more tolerant, more civil than lives lived in what I have sometimes called, perhaps a bit harshly, the sandbox of self-absorption, in which people who've never really grown up are absorbed in their own self-absorption. I'm starting to repeat myself a bit here. So that's one big difference. I think a second big difference is that through the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, evangelical Catholics in the 21st century can give a thicker account, a tougher account, a more compelling account of our commitments to religious freedom for all, our commitments to the right to life from conception until natural death, our insistence on the dignity of every human person, no matter what their status or condition, then can the rest of the external culture. That's very important for democracy in North America because our Canadian and American democracies today are resting on very, very thin cultural foundations. And the evangelical Catholicism of the 21st century can help thicken those foundations a bit, which I think is good for everyone.
Well, since you've mentioned democracy, and admittedly, the Catholic Church is not a political party, but let me see if I can pull an analogy out of the air here, and you tell me if this makes any sense. The Republican Party, in your last national election, learned that if it wanted to be in some respects, smaller tent party, because it wanted more people who were more purely small c conservative in it, they weren't going to have more adherents. In fact, they were going to lose, and that's what happened. And I wonder whether an evangelical Catholic church can still be a big tent church which has more adherents in it as opposed to fewer.
It not only can be, Steve, it must be. The proposal in evangelical Catholicism is not for some stripped down, slimmed down Catholicism of perfected people. That's never existed. It's never going to exist this side of the kingdom of heaven. And that kind of vision of a totally purified church, of sanctified people living perfect lives, is frankly a kind of 16th century Protestant heresy. It's not a Catholic idea of what the church is or what the church should be. But perhaps more to the point, I think if you look around the Catholic Church in North America, and you look at where the church is vital and vibrant and young, you find evangelical Catholicism, whether that's in the campus ministry at Texas A&M University, in College Station, Texas, right in the heart of the American Bible Belt, a campus ministry that has thousands of students every Sunday at Mass and has produced more religious vocations than the University of Notre Dame over the past 25 years. If you look at the parish in Greenville, South Carolina, another part of the Bible Belt, pastored by my friend Father Scott Newman, who's one of the men to whom I dedicate evangelical Catholicism, you see a booming Catholic parish in a very difficult cultural environment. Why? Because the gospel is being preached without compromise. People are being nourished by Bible and sacraments, and they're loving it. If you look at those parts of the Canadian church that are growing, in my experience in Edmonton with Archbishop Richard Smith, in Vancouver with Archbishop Mike Miller, in Toronto with Cardinal Tom Collins, all of whom I'm happy to count as either acquaintances or good friends, it's because the gospel in full is being proposed. So evangelical Catholicism tends to produce very good results.
I'm just curious, did you see the George Weigel interview I just did before you came out here?
I saw parts of it,
You saw
yes.
part of it, okay. Well, you know, he is making a forceful argument as a Catholic intellectual for an evangelical Catholicism. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I celebrate George's passion and his freedom to speak as a Catholic intellectual. I think that's extraordinary, and it's a wonderful contribution. I wish that others are allowed to speak as well. And part of what we've noticed in the last two pontificates is a kind of, I would argue, a fortress-like understanding of the Church emerge. After the opening of the windows of John the 23rd and Vatican II, where John the 23rd said, we have to open the windows of the Church to the modern world, I've had a sense that, especially during Pope Benedict's reign, there's been a different metaphor at play. It's almost like closing the windows, drawing the curtains, and relying on an internal air filtration system to get out the bad air. A problem with that is when you open the windows, you not only get fresh air, you sometimes get bad smells. You get sounds from the street. You get different voices yelling. You get a different reality because you're open to the world.
You're okay with that?
I'm okay with that, and Vatican II was okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
This is important because the Spirit is not, the Holy Spirit in Catholic teaching or Christian teaching is not enclosed within one community. It's at work in the world.
No, fair enough, but I shouldn't speak for George, but I think I'm right in characterizing the way he put it as, not everything's up for debate in this church. You know, there are lots of things that we can debate, but there are some things that I'm sorry are just not debatable, and if you want to be a Catholic, you've got to sign on to that, right?
Yeah, that's right. There are certain basic understandings. However, everyone is worthy of respect within the debate. And it's an attitudinal shift toward love, compassion, and openness to hearing diversity. When people are made to feel somehow less than human or not part of the community when they're expressing themselves, that's a problem.
You think the church has done that?
I think it has. Since John Paul II's time as Pope, from now, over 100 theologians, bishops, women religious, priests have been investigated, silenced, and or censured. There has been a kind of what I call a closing of the Catholic mind. And this has residual effects because people then become gun shy, as it were, to express ideas. I've talked to theologians at Notre Dame, where I used to teach in the United States, and they say the plug has basically been pulled on sexual ethics in the Catholic Church because people are afraid. That's been confirmed by Toronto theologians I've talked to.
You think this is a direct result of Benedict's papacy?
It's a direct result of, even before that, of Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, as head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, going after people like Father Charles Curran and others who were exploring sexual ethics. It doesn't mean that they do not have a right to explore these things or to question them. That's for sure. But part of it is, how are they treated? How are they brought into dialogue? How are they corrected, etc.? And sometimes it's been, I think, much more heavy-handed than a Christian charity response would allow.
Okay. I'm going to read an excerpt of something now. You can look on the monitors here in the studio to read along with me as we talk about the extent of the Catholic Church's problems today. Let's go overseas. Recent surveys show Catholics in the Republic of Ireland are deserting their faith faster than believers in almost any other nation worldwide. Statistics are one way to tell the story. In 1984, 87% of Irish Catholics went to weekly Mass. In 2011, Archbishop Dermot Martin said 18% of Dublin church members attend services. Images are another option. Gaggles of green-bedecked youngsters and young adults line the St. Paddy's Day parade route, but in Dublin's cathedral, youthful faces only speckle the crowd. Does this, at the risk of torturing a metaphor here, sound like the church needs more than just a fresh coat of green?
Absolutely. And in terms of dealing honestly with the sex offenders and the sex abuse scandal and the rape of children within the church, you can see some of the direct results of that in Ireland. But we can also look to Quebec in the early 1960s and see a similar phenomenon.
You want a quiet revolution.
Well, this occurred. Not that I wanted, but it happened. And it became a very important teaching moment. There's a wonderful Protestant theologian, Canadian, Douglas John Hall, who taught at McGill for years. And he used to say, the bishops in Quebec after the Quiet Revolution wrote some very powerful, humble statements. After their power and prestige had evaporated and their churches emptied. They said, what is this telling us about our arrogance and our hubris and our pride in an earlier period? What is the Spirit telling us now about how we have to be present to Quebec society? We've had to learn through, in a sense, desertion and humiliation, what it means really to be a Christian community. And so this is a soul-searching time for the Irish church, but it's also for the larger church. And they have to take seriously and reflect very fundamentally on what has happened with this abuse scandal. And if you're in a protector mode, a fortress church mentality, if you're in a mode that closes doors and windows and tries to vacate the problems, you may not be as self-critical and truthful. And you protect members of the church who were committing crimes such as sex abuse, rather than bring this out in the open.
I'm going to start by telling you a little story.
Okay.
Because the last, you told us a story, now I get to tell you a story. The first time you were here was back in the studio 2 days, and I'm guessing it was probably 10 or 15 years ago or something. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
And I remember after our shoot was over, a number of the producers came up to me and we just started talking about you behind your back. And somebody said, what is she anyway? And somebody said, well, her last name's Abraham, so she's probably Jewish. And I said, I don't think so. I don't know, something about it. And somebody said, well, I don't know what she is. And now we know. Now we have the whole story here. But that thing that very organically and naturally happened to us happened to you. And you wrote in this book, in fact, you're the brown girl with a Jewish last name who went to a Catholic school. At what point in your life did you start to ask Mom and Dad, what am I anyway?
Yeah. Yes, it is probably the most common question I am asked. And I started asking it when I was in grade school. I would say around grade 2 or 3 that I came to them with the very questions people were asking me and said, well, so how did we get this name? Where are we from? And I knew that my parents were born in India and that their parents were born in India, but we weren't really Indian. We didn't have any of those outward cultural symbols of being Indian. But we were very European in culture, and we had, you know, English and Irish and Portuguese and some Scottish and Russian, and it was when I was about 10 years old that I met my father's father for the first time and saw Chinese features that I really was thrown for a loop.
Absolutely. Let's bring the photo up. And it's interesting, when you said, okay, tell us who they are.
These are my parents.
That's a long time ago, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It was 1953, and they had just recently arrived in England, and those are my father's parents. And the man with the tie is my grandfather, Albert, and he was sitting in a chair in the front room the first time I met him, and he looked over and I smiled at him and saw this familiar face, but also something that I didn't expect to see.
Well, let's go through this. When you asked your parents, Mom and Dad, when people ask me what I am, what should I say? What did they tell you to say?
You know, it seemed to cause, there was no simple answer. There was a certain amount of, well, tell them that you're English. And I would be, well, I don't look English. Well, tell them you're Eurasian, but where is Eurasia? Well, tell them you're Canadian, which, at the time was not a satisfying answer to provide, like, your grade 2 and 3 friends. And I just couldn't get over this idea that tell them really had that ring of, look, let's just come up with an answer and get past that question. I didn't understand anything then about, the people that were my ancestors and sort of this uncomfortable history that had come with them at that time.
Your grandfather Albert didn't speak of his background or his father.
Right.
How come?
I was never able to ask that question of him myself. When I met him at 10, that was the last time I met him. And my father has since told me many times that he would ask questions of his father, but his father would never be drawn out about his background, that he was a very quiet man. My father has these recollections of his father playing the crosswords in the corner with the newspaper, coming home from work behind the newspaper, not saying too much. And it was actually only from his mother that my father learned that his grandfather was likely Chinese.
And why was it that your grandmother expected "we're English, end of story" to actually be accepted as the end of the story?
I didn't know this then, but my grandmother, now this is my mother's mother, she was the one that I used to have these great sort of, I would say, Sunday afternoon debates with. She would say, well, we're English. And I'd say, but Nana, look at us, right? We have tans all year round,
And good teeth. We can't be English.
And so she would say, well, we had some Portuguese, and which seemed plausible, but I didn't understand then that, she had grown up in a time and a place where being something other than Anglo in British India was a liability. And it was something that I think when you come to a country like Canada, when we did in the 70s, and everybody's being encouraged to celebrate their roots and bring their flags and bring their dishes, their traditional home-cooked meals from the home country. And here we seem to have come from this tradition of not really talking about your roots.
Your great-grandfather, John Abraham,
Right.
before you embarked on this journey, what did you know about him?
I had known about him since childhood, sort of 3 things that really stuck with me. One was that he was possibly Chinese. One was that we'd heard he was a circus juggler and that he had disappeared. So when you're a kid and you find out that you might have had a relative who was in the circus, you sort of glom onto that. And you think, wow, how fantastic. And I wrote this whole school essay about having a great-grandfather who had juggled since he was a child, and it was this, made-up epic for a school assignment. And but that was pretty much all that we did know about him.
Well, we're going to be careful not to give away too much of the plot, because it does read in a way like a bit of a murder mystery. I mean, you're following the plots and the clues, but clearly the title, "The Juggler's Children," he's the juggler.
Right.
Now, your maternal grandfather, the captain,
Right.
Frederick William Crooks. Photo to come.
Right.
What did you know about him?
So unlike my father's grandfather, my mother's grandfather was always the topic at parties of one sort of joke or comment or another, and he sounded like a terrific ancestor who had saved drowning people from the high seas, who had been this outstanding sea captain, and he had ties to great wealth, and he was also said to have been a high-ranking member of the Masons, and so much so when he died at the age of 32. He had beriberi, and this is why a lot of these tall tales could never be really fleshed out. There was a sense that he was beyond the reach of knowing these things, but that there had been overtures from distant wealthy relatives and the Masons themselves who contributed money to raise my grandfather and his sister. So again, it was all sort of fantastical stuff, and I wondered, coming out as it often did at family parties, that how much of it was actually true.
So, Carolyn, a lot of people are just sort of content to go with the family lore, and that's it. At what point does it for you become, I've got to get DNA tested, I got to bring science into this, I really got to get to the bottom of this?
So it's 10 years ago. In terms of, you know, what influences any one of us in our lives, I mean, my professional job, I was covering science all the time for the Globe and Mail. I was writing about genetics. I was, you know, seeing what was being done and what was possible. And the human genome had just been mapped when I met Craig Venter for an interview in the hotel in Toronto. And he was talking about having just mapped his own genome. And that was pretty big news at the time because everybody thought it was some combination of anonymous people, and it actually was his genome. And in the course of explaining how fantastic this was and what you could learn about yourself, these interesting tidbits about yourself, he mentioned he'd learned all about his ancestry, or interesting things in his DNA, not sort of this big picture stuff about how we had evolved from, you know, primal creatures, but rather where in the world his ancestors had come from. And I was really struck by this. In fact, I tuned out thinking about, well, me, you know, for a few minutes. And, but then realized pretty quickly that, okay, this cost, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars then. The genome itself was, you know, close to $3 billion all said and done. You know, what were the chances? Like, file that under the to-do list down the road.
But it put something in your head.
It put something in my head, and I remember having a couple of conversations with people shortly after that saying, wouldn't that be neat if I could? And not more than a couple of years later, I had my daughter, my first child. She was born during SARS. And it was one of those crazy times where I had been covering the news, and next thing you know, I was in the news because we ended up in a quarantined hospital. And we had all this time, about 6 days, my husband and I and my daughter, and no one to see. And nobody was sharing digital pictures at that time commonly. And everybody was saying, who does she look like? What does she look like? You know, you're making these phone calls, and what you realize, what they're really asking is, who do you see in your child? Do you see your mother, your father, your grandfather? Do you see an uncle, an aunt? Who do you see in this new life? And it was kind of a slow burn, but a recognition that we are always talking about DNA in that sense. Mm-hmm. What is going to sort of emerge in that quirky tongue of DNA in that new life? And I started to think, you know what? She is going to grow up. You know, my husband's got some German, some Swedish, some Irish and English, and she's going to grow up and she's going to say, hey, so what are we?
So what are we? Yeah.
And I thought, you know, surely I'd be able to give her some kind of answer, and wouldn't it be neat to give this a try? And by then, amazingly, as we've talked about on your show before, the price to do it just fell. It just fell like a duck in hunting season. It was just down, and suddenly it became not only possible to do this personally, but eminently affordable.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.